We are next pleased and delighted to introduce Dr. David Brailer. Dr. Brailer has seen healthcare from as many perspectives as anyone. Trained as a physician and economist, Dr. Brailer has been an internist, a professor at the Wharton School, a successful entrepreneur, a policymaker, and now an investor. In 2004, he was appointed by President George W. Bush to be the country's first National Coordinator for Health Information Technology, where he laid the foundation for the digitization of healthcare. Currently, Dr. Brailer is the managing partner and CEO of Health Evolution Partners, a healthcare private equity firm in San Francisco. As a former student of his, I am delighted and honored to introduce him as our next keynote speaker. Dr. Brailer.
Thank you, Ray. You can extend your hand. Thanks. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be with you. I share Tom's comments about how wonderful it is to see that out the windows. I can't stay with you the entire day. That's because, as you know, there's a very important event in San Francisco that I have to get back for. It's the opening of the movie San Andreas, and I think it's very important, I'm being very serious now, for me to be with my children as we watch our house slide into the ocean. The good thing about a big earthquake is I could probably get back into the restaurants that all the techies have pushed us out of here in the past several weeks of boom. I'm going to talk about really a flexion point in the health IT industry, and I'm going to take a little bit of an investor view, maybe a lot, but you know, as Ray said, I have shared so many different points of view in the healthcare industry, I don't know that I have any single point of view. Now, I called it at a crossroads. I have a 15-year-old son who looked at my presentation and said, Dad, that's the most boring title on earth. You're going to bore these people to death. So here's your title, Health IT's Double McTwist Moment. Some of you may know Shaun White as perhaps the greatest snowboarder on earth. And he shares the home mountain where we have our home in Tahoe. And this is his famous move, the Double McTwist. And so the point is, it's virtually impossible to pull off, but if you do, you look like a genius. And he didn't pull it off, which is why he didn't make it into the last Olympics. So here we are with Health IT's Double McTwist, and I'm going to start way back in 2004. This is the framework that we created and published in the Office of the National Coordinator. And it was really to get the federal agencies lined up towards how to take health IT out into the world. We didn't expect at the time it would become a rallying cry across the entire industry. I still, to this day, am shocked with the depth and fervor and the perseverance of this. And there have been many versions of this strategic framework. 2007, it was re-updated. 2009, 11, just recently, Karen updated it. But they largely are the same, and they come down to really 4 pieces. Informed practice, electronic records, interconnect clinicians, data portability, personalizing care, a lot going on there, and then improving population health. And there's lots of ways to slice and dice this, but it's the mental framework that to this day I use to think about kind of where we are and what we need to do. And let me just start really with informed clinical practice. You know, I had a family member, an aunt, a quite old aunt, who was in a hospital. I put her in a hospital for a couple of days for some diagnostic testing. She was in, you know, a fabulous Northeastern academic medical center, the best known to mankind, one of those, right? You have them here in New York. And I was there with her, and this nurse brought in her Cal with Epic, of course, and was, am I allowed to say that? And was charting away and just bitching and moaning and complaining about this electronic record and how she had to do all this checkboxing and it got in the way of her doing clinical care and how this could be just imposed on her, and whoever decided to do this should be shot, and you know, just, I mean, on and on every time she came in. And the next day she was in and doing the same thing, and the CEO of the hospital, who's a close friend and knew that we were there, came in to say hi. And he comes in and gives me a hug. David, how are you doing? And all this. This is your aunt, etc. And he turns to me and says, do you know who this guy is? You wouldn't be standing at that electronic record right now if it wasn't for him. And I said to my aunt, I said, you know, you've got like a 50% chance of being killed overnight. So we have made tremendous progress with electronic records. And I call it maxing out because I think that market is kind of maxed out. If you're a hospital, can't do business without it. Ambulatory is still catching up. But we're in a mode now where the gears of investment shift. You know, big inpatient systems are now looking for revenue diversification, revenue growth. There's more consolidation happening. There's a lot of activity that have to do with really, I think ultimately, is health IT its own sector of the IT economy, or does it get absorbed into the much, much, much bigger IT economy? My bet is IT absorbs health IT, and you'll see it here first. On the ambulatory side, there's a lot of sorting out that's going on. There are still several hundred attested electronic records in the ambulatory space, and whether we're going to see many of those get pushed out or consolidate. There's a lot of plays going on. There's IPOs going on. There's acquisitions going on. There is capital raising going on. There's various experiments. So this area we've all talked about and thought about. I'm not going to dwell on it, just to acknowledge that this is a very mature sector of the health IT economy, and it's going to be a place where you're going to see a lot of springboard action come from. Now, the second area of personalizing has many dimensions to it, the most visible of which to all of us are the apps on the 500 million smartphones that are now out and being used. And by the way, about 30% of these are used by people older than 65. And so, I think this idea that tech is for the 30-year-olds and healthcare is for the 60-year-olds and they don't cross has really been breached by the data and the intensive data on use, and really the states of minds of app developers who are thinking about that person booming into healthcare utilization. This is not the only place where personalization is happening. Tom mentioned and actually had a very thoughtful discussion with you about telemedicine. And this is an area where I agree. This is one example of the classic paradigm where innovators innovate and regulators get drugged behind. Right? There's kind of a view in the government after the electronic record success that it's the role of the government to drag the private sector forward. And that's just never been the model in tech. And in telemedicine, you see this. You see tremendous resistance. And I point to the litigation that was filed against the Texas Medical Board by Teladoc to try to stop them from interfering with this vital technology in telemedicine. So there's a lot going on in personalization. I think it's an area that's going to continue to see tremendous growth, tremendous diversification over the course of the next decade. It's got so many pieces that I'm not going to try to do justice to it, because my goal today is to talk about what I think is not getting done, not kind of where things are getting done. If you want a Q&A into this, we could do this. Population health, which has a lot of dimensions to it, but the very notion that we came to is one of how do we go upstream and do early detection and prevent this onslaught of disease from coming. The question about nutrition is a good one. I think that's an area where I certainly hope that we begin defining bad nutrition as a healthcare condition in some way that we can deal with it. But population health has really taken on the view in the industry today of how do we manage a population under risk. And you see, this is just one summary from a class slide last year of 53 major vendors now exist. And these tend to be hybrids. They're IT and services, and they've got some interoperability and big data analytics and kind of platform solutions that work together for population management. But this has been an area that has seen tremendous private sector investment. There are about 60 or 70 LBOs, middle market venture firms, that are actively involved in this space. There have not been any true kind of IPOs in this space, but I think you'll see it coming up. And I think you'll see just a lot of M&A activity. Some are within insurance companies, some within providers, some independent. But this is an area that builds on the platform that the electronic records started. Okay, so why did I go through billions of dollars of investment, billions of dollars of progress in 5 minutes? It's because if you want to drill into those, we can do it in Q&A. What I want to talk to you about is the area that's near and dear to my heart, where I felt was absolutely essential to the success of all of these, which has had very little progress. And this is the idea of interoperability, of interconnection, of data portability. Call it what you like, but it's an area that we believed in 2004 was the platform. It was the essential ingredient that the electronic record was built upon, that population health was mobilized by, that personalization was empowered by, and it has largely been left behind. I was pleased to see Healthix out front. There are still a number of very strong RIOs and HIEs around the United States that have moved forward and done well, but we have not seen the broad commercialization depth and absolute absence of investment in this space. And I think up to recently, and I do want to emphasize recently because there have been some very nice turns in the past few months, almost no policy attention in this space. So, why? Well, in part, we are saddled in this world where portability has a technical framework that's very challenging. It has a regulatory framework that's very challenging. It has an economic framework that is very challenging. And the combination of those creates a very difficult milieu for success. HIPAA is obsolete in many ways. I just wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal really to say to the public what I've been saying to people behind closed doors, and frankly heard most people agree with, which is that we have this ambiguity about who owns the data. And I came down and said the patient should own the data because the marketplace can't really function when everybody believes they own the data and have the rights of blockage and other things. We also have a challenge at best in the privacy and security components that protect information. But the regulatory framework is not designed for the digital era, and we have to think about that piece. A lot of the way that we've thought about the architecture of data sharing has been very enterprise-based. We think about the question, and this was where we started 10 years ago, of how do you get a hospital to connect to a hospital, as opposed to how do you get a hospital to connect to 300 doctors? Or how do we get two people to connect together? And one area where I see a lot of progress is where the app makers and the people that think about the consumer endpoint don't view the enterprise as relevant to data sharing. In fact, they just want to skip right to the person. Now, to do that, the patient has to own their data, to be able to say to the holders, give me my data. So we're back to the policy framework, but there's been a lot of, I would say, legacy thinking here. And as the kind of one of the people that 20 years ago thought a lot as an entrepreneur about this, I guess I'm guilty of being a legacy thinker. But I do view the approach we've taken to this as running out of legs and having a point of view that lets us say this information should move as a matter of routine. It should be a broad reach into various uses is just coming. There are a lot of catalysts, and Tom mentioned some of these to you. I just want to catalog a few. And the point of this is very simply, for those of you that are entrepreneurs, for those of you that are investors, for those of you that influence this space, if you want to get into a market where I believe you're going to see tremendous swing and upgrowth and innovative opportunities in the next 5 years, I think this is one of the places to be. There's a lot going on in personalization. There's a lot going on in population health. But those are the results of decisions made 5 years ago. And it's not that they're not opportunities, but I don't think they're going to be as large or as pristine as some of the ones here. So we saw the mega rule, and I won't go through the details of this, but HIPAA did have an upgrade in the ACA that is little known, but it changed the so-called form and time rules that really try to shorten the amount of time it takes for data to be shared and to create more liberality about the forms, moving towards electronic sharing as opposed to a PDF. Tom mentioned the SDR legislation, and I was very happy with this because it declared information sharing as a national objective and proposed penalties for information blocking. I was very, very pleased to see the play that the information blocking report that was released by UNC a couple of months ago has received. Because I think it shows the resonance of this topic and the idea that if I'm a vendor, I am creating obstacles to the data moving, or if I'm a hospital, I'm creating obstacles, not least of which are the really enormous charges that one would have to pay to have copies of your record moved around. And the SGR at least is a step as a spirit of the Congress in this direction. 21st century cures, I know we discussed that in the last session, but in the current markup, it creates a universal patient identifier. Now, it's done in the framework of research, but we have never figured out a way to get this done so we can have a unique identifier that organizes all the data sets about a person. And if this survives through the various cuts, this is a very controversial topic you can imagine with patients' rights groups and others, but in speaking with some of them, I think they've come to believe this is actually becoming in patients' interest to have an identifier as opposed to not in their interest to have an identifier, because they get things like much better research and much faster streaming of new discoveries. But if this happens, it's a key driver. We've obviously talked about value-based payment. There's nothing like a business model for value that creates the value and information that helps you accomplish that. I mentioned the UNC blocking report. And the other thing that has been really encouraging to me is health plans moving off the sidelines. I cited CalIndex here, which is an initiative between Blue Shield of California and Anthem in California to create essentially a repository that can grab information from providers. And basically the idea is that health information access is a covered benefit, just like having imaging and just like having a drug, et cetera. But plans clearly see this in their purview to accomplish goals of improving care, but also they're getting increasingly concerned about sitting across the table from providers that are controlling health information and using it as a tool in negotiation. So there's a lot of play in this space right now. So the policy debate, who owns the data? What does it mean? If I own my data, can I deny you from having it? Can I change it? Can I delete it? I mean, there's a lot of policy questions here that are going to have to be addressed, but they do have to be addressed. Should the thing that is the platform of all this, the medical internet, the nationwide health information network, which is kind of the secure encrypted channels that tie this data movement together, should it be government operated? Should it be in the private sector? Should it be kind of a consortium like the internet was born? It's a very active question right now. And I think people have very different views there, but there is a lot of efforts, and my guess is in the end there's not going to be one, there are going to be many, and there will be some government operated, some private sector. Value-based payments, are they sufficient? Do they really economically drive information portability? They're certainly necessary. Are they sufficient is a question that I think will be determined by the pace and scale of those policies and how they get implemented. And I think the underlying big question, and this is one where I have come to decidedly negative views, is whether or not providers and even many health plans have the competencies, the capacities, and the scale to actually be information managers on behalf of their patients. I envision a world where providers are great at providing care and plans underwriting, and yes, they need information in their jobs, but the principal body of information that's managed for a person is not in those enterprises, except where they are sophisticated enough, willing to make the R&D investments enough, and have unique circumstances enough that they're as good at it as some of the biggest tech companies that can drive this. And it's possible big mainstream tech players will move into this. It could be that health IT companies will scale to the point that they can sustain this. But I think in this world of cybersecurity fears, and I look at how much a health plan or how much a hospital spends on cybersecurity compared to banks, compared to other targets, and I look at the enormous value that health information has. And we all know why it has value, right? Because if I steal your health information, I can fictitiously bill your insurance company forever, and nobody will detect it. And if I use your credit card that I steal, I've got $50 and it's done. So there's a real marketplace and a real vulnerability here that's quite systematic. And this is one of the questions that we're going to have to deal with. So I'm not going to go through the landscape, but I think it's fair to say that health information technology is 10 years into a 30-year upswing. We won't be done with this rapid pace of investment scaling until the operating budget of healthcare has 6 to 8% of its expenditures per year in information technology. And if you look at how much we're spending on health IT, which is about 7 times more than we did 10 years ago, we're still only pacing below 3%. So there's an enormous catch-up to a much larger level. So you're going to see a marketplace that will double in size at least 3 times between now and, I'll say 10 years from now, perhaps 15. And increasingly going into areas that will have deeper reach and penetration into what we call traditional care delivery, whether they're at the very platform level about where information is or out at the user experience level, is a detail that we could talk about. But I'm very bullish on this because I think it's only going to be private capital that's going to be able to make this happen, largely because I think the government did it once. It's once and done on electronic records, and you're not going to see the next $30 billion effort to fund apps or to fund interoperability. And so I think it's at an end point. So with this, let me stop and say that I'd be happy to take questions, and I'm again just delighted that you're doing this because we're in the midst of something that I think is quite powerful, and you're the ones that are going to drive it. Thank you.
Questions for Dr. Brailer?
Hi, Mark Berger, Pfizer. Your last comment is one I want to probe a little bit more. So there has been a lot of discussion around the creation of a learning healthcare system. There was a creation of PCORI. There are other activities going on in the government. NIH has woken up to the idea that there is real-world effectiveness and they have to pay attention to it. But aside from what we're seeing in the 21st century cures, we're really not seeing any further attention being placed on creating an infrastructure to make a learning healthcare system. And there's always been a virtuous cycle between government investment and private investment. So do you think that really there's not going to be additional government investment in this area? And if not, how can the private sector actually be successful? Because I don't think the private sector can be successful without a cooperative environment and ongoing investment from the public sector.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question, because let me first clarify. Obviously, there's going to be continued investment, whether it's in research or in other areas. The point I was making is in raw IT. Yeah. I really think that's unlikely, because most members of Congress feel poisoned by the high-tech investment. There's been tremendous blowback, and we're just at the point where we're starting to ask questions about how much net new investment did you create compared to just simply displacing private sector investment, and what did we get or not get for it? And I think when that all works through, there's going to be, as Warren Buffett says, many people swimming naked in the tide. So my point was not a disparagement on government investment. Obviously, as a 50% player in the healthcare industry, they're here to stay. But to your question about learning, I don't view the tension being government and private sector. I think the tension is science versus empiricism. And 21st Century Cures puts its toes into that. Some of the other bills that have come through in other areas have put their toes into that. But let's just talk about just the drug chain itself. I think the simple question is, when are we going to put as much emphasis on post-market, real-world experience about what is really happening with drugs and what side effects do they have and what benefits do they have and what new indications are we discovering through the real-world experimentation that we know goes on with those smartphones and devices that everybody carries, as evidenced by, right now, patient-reported outcomes that are done on their phones. And actually a very favorable approach the FDA has taken to using those. I just think that's ultimately at odds with the domination of that vertical by scientists who absolutely believe that there's only one way to do this, which is double-blind randomized controlled trials. That was drilled into my head as a doctor. I totally get it. But we're never going to get there in that world. And so I think that tension is significant, it's profound, and frankly, I think it's one of the great tensions in American society about what is the role of science whenever science can't answer some of the questions that we've got to confront. And I think health IT is not going to wait and sit and let that all get figured out. It's going to push forward. And you're going to see tremendous experimentation. If you look, I speak dismissively of the apps, but partially it's because I could throw a stone from my office and probably take out 5 of those companies. And, there are a lot. There are really a lot. But there is real depth and very smart thinking about where does the data come from, what's the quality of the data, how do we improve this experience. It's not just a cheesy user tool. And a lot of them are built around the drug vertical. And I'm very impressed with a number that I've seen that I think go very deep in understanding how people use drugs and why they use drugs and to what benefit. So, I do think there's a role, but, we're in the collision of the techies with the legacy thinkers, and this collision is going to last for years. I think ultimately the techies win because that's where the better knowledge is, but it'll take a while.
David Klein.
David, thank you. Yes. Excellent remarks, and thank you for getting this started many years ago. You're the originator of much of what's going on here today. 2 questions. They may be related. I'll let you decide that. The first is, as you look at all the natural experiments that have taken place regarding information sharing, so-called HIEs, what comes to mind as being most successful? What can we learn from sort of a retrospective view? Is there 1 or 2 or 3 models that are out there? And then sort of going forward, and again, it may be tied to the same question, as you look at the end of your presentation and investment, the horizons that people like you with your fund tend to look at are not far out. You need to find a return within 2-3 years. And again, coming back to the notion of scale as core to creating value here, where do you see the first examples of value showing up? You know, what would be the sorts of things that we, as whatever role we're playing these days, you know, should be pursuing? Thank you.
Look, they're great questions, and I will answer them somewhat separately. To the latter question, which I think is, you know, the one I do think a lot about, there is, I don't know if I can go backwards. You know, the place where I think investors want to play is in the middle layer. You know, the infrastructure layer takes way too long. It's very scaled, very slow returns. You know, the kind of endpoint user experiences are quite rich. Let me just see if I can skip forward. But I think in the middle layer, where you're looking at the fundamentals of identifying people, of creating security layers, of creating, if you would, the tools, the toolbox that make this work. I won't even try, because you guys are going to get a seizure from watching the slides go by. I think there's a lot of lift there. And so, you know, to me, when I look at this space, I'll tell you very candidly, what worries me more than investment return horizon, because this is such a frothy market that if you have a smart, good company that's got good things, it's going to be bought by somebody regardless of what you think the intrinsic value proposition is. It's the flip side of that, which is things are so expensive. You know, we've found very few. I found a lot of companies I love. I found very few companies that we can afford in terms of just the fundamentals and the value. This is, I don't want to say a bubble, but it's very, very bubble-like. In terms of the prior question, you know, as I look out at the experience that we've had, I don't see a lot of real success stories. I've seen heroics, many strong leaders who have driven, whether people or organizations that have driven interoperability forward, have created the capabilities, you know, and they're in various markets. But I don't think any of those I would consider a shining success, because I'm not sure they're sustainable. And so what are the elements of it? Where there have been closer sustainability, there has been a simple legal infrastructure. Well, how do we create scalable, simple legal infrastructures? We have policy changes that make what is now difficult easy. There has been lightweight technology. One of the problems that many of these efforts have suffered from is very heavy, burdensome central architecture. I have built those in the past, and they've been necessary. They're not necessary anymore. So you look at lightweight architectures, very mobile, very flexible, as-needed technology. And thirdly, it has been a mentality around solving specific problems as opposed to solving general problems. A general problem is, let's move someone's data from one place to the other. A specific problem is, let's help manage diabetes better. So if you know, where there is lightweight, there's simple legal clarity, and there is a problem solution mentality, you see sustainable efforts. And so, you know, I guess what I would say is, I think, you know, information sharing is going from being kind of a public agency type thinking to a commercial type thinking, where those things start to commit. And I think that's going to be very encouraging to watch that play out.
One last question.
Good morning. Betty Wall with LPA Software Solutions. I was interested that you had cloud on your chart. And in my experience, a lot of the infrastructures that have been built by some of the large cloud providers are more robust, more secure with biometrics and things like that, and much more of a secure environment than a lot of times the on-prem environment at some of the providers. But given all the privacy issues and concerns about the data sensitivity, I wanted to get your perspective on the role of cloud moving forward, where you think it's a good fit today, and how you think that will evolve within the healthcare industry over the next decade or so.
Yeah. Well, you look, I think, you know, whether we call it cloud today or ASP, you know, 8, 10 years ago, you know, we have seen a movement from never, ever to, yeah, under these circumstances. So plot out that trajectory, and you end up with either one of two conditions. One, this is a key part of our architecture that fits alongside enterprise things that we do. And I think you'll see that as the default mode for most organizations for a very simple reason. You get a lot more for your money out of it. You get to rent world-class talent in security and access layers and metadata and all the pieces you could never, ever afford. and that I don't think you trust your vendor to do. Or you end up in a world where, oh yeah, everything's on the cloud. Now I remember those days when it used to be enterprise. What was back in 2015? That seems so long ago. I think it could easily get there, and I say that because if you look at the journey in other industries, that's exactly where we're going. We're always 10 years behind, but you see it end up. It's driven by raw, brutal economics. It is driven by the absolute difficult reality of talent. And I think if you want to know what the catalyst is, I'll tell you the answer 100 data hack breaches from now. Because I do agree with the old adage that there's only two kinds of healthcare organizations, those that know they've been breached and those that don't know they've been breached. And I think as the public sees the tremendous risk that data is exposed to, there's going to be a very strong legislative push, a very strong push for other solutions, and I think cloud is going to be part of that. Great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Appreciate the time to be with you all. Thanks.